Check. Okay, good. If y'all could start making your way to your seats, we're going to get going here. Welcome and thank you for coming to this presentation. This is, I believe, the first time we've had an ethics presentation for AICP credits here at the CNU. In our discussion about this as a group, one of the things that we're going to challenge you all with are some ethical dilemmas that we've seen in practice, in different dilemmas that you can consider for your own practice as professionals as well. We'll try to make this fun. We're going to go over the broad overview of our ethics and what we do as planners, but also how does that apply and how does that actually happen. We're going to start with Ann Bagley. Ann is from the Dallas area. She's a community planner and consultant. Ann's work is focused on comprehensive plans, ordinances, park development, and training planning commissions. She's worked both in the public and private sectors. She now serves on the Dallas City Plan Commission. Ann is in her second term as a board member elected at large for the Board of Directors for the American Planning Association. She also serves as the planning officials development officer for the APA Texas. Thank you, Ann. I'll follow Ann with my ethical dilemma. My name is Joe Minicozzi. I operate a small consulting firm in Asheville, North Carolina. The work that I'm going to present to you is my role as an activist inside my community. And we're going to follow with Dan Slone. Many of you know Dan's work here at the CNU. He's a frequent presenter here. Dan is a partner at McGuireWoods, a limited liability partnership based in Richmond, Virginia. Dan assists innovative clients in designing and implementing their projects. He helps create the right entities put together for appropriate strategies to overcome impediments and put together effective contracts for new types of relationships that include green businesses, for developers, for localities, professionals, and nonprofit organizations. He's been a member of the Board of Directors for the Congress for New Urbanism since 2011, and Dan was a charter member for the Congress. He's been on the General Council from 1992 to 2010. He's a graduate of Michigan Law School and the Birmingham Southern College with a bachelor's degree in philosophy and political science. Dan has also co-authored the legal guide to urban and sustainable development for architects, planners, and developers with Doris Goldstein. Finally, Dan is a recipient of the Henry David Thoreau Environmental Conservator Better Housing Coalition 2000. He's a Better Housing Coalition 2010 groundbreaker. It's hard to read. I don't have my. Okay. I also don't have my glasses, so it's really particularly challenging for me. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ann and get this rolling. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, Joe. I was really surprised to be invited to be part of this, but I want to give you all an idea of planning ethics and how it applies to everybody. CNU and APA are not competitors in my mind. We're all working together for sustainable, walkable, livable communities. So I think we have to share some of our values and how we approach things. So, okay. The American Planning Association basically has two codes of ethics. One is ethical principles in planning, and that's for everybody that practices planning, rather the art of planning, as we'd like to call it. And then beyond that is the American Institute of Certified Planners. Now, if you're here to get AICP credits, you're going to have to double check. If you don't get them when you go online, you can go online and self-report them for the amount of time. So what are ethics? Well, you've got kind of a combination where your morals intersect with the rules. And moral decisions are judgment of what's good or bad. It's a value judgment. So you're making that. But when you look at ethics, they're principles of conduct. and they're based on rules or standards governing members of a profession or a group. Now, the state of Texas also has an ethics code. If you're from Texas, if you're not, you might want to look at it. Formal system that explicitly adopted by the state of Texas in the state statutes 171 and 176. And it's really mostly on conflicts of interest and disclosure of relationships. I'm trying to do this two-handed. Well, ethical principles in planning has been around for a long time, and it was codified in 1992, and it's really a statement of, and a guide to ethical conduct for those who participate in the planning process. I'm not going to read you all of this. You can find it online at planning.org if you search hard enough, but you can find it. But what it does in this ethical principles in planning is presents a set of principles that are, held in common with other planners, with people who work in planning, and appointed and elected officials. And basically, the planning process exists to serve the public interest. And sometimes that's continuous debate. And sometimes it's general principles, and then we're going to look today, I guess, at two case-by-case situations. Some of the ethics cases look at how deep a hole you can actually dig yourself into. And, but it reviews that we need to look at the policies and actions that serve an entire community. Now, whether you're a member of APA or not, these are good guidelines. And basically, it's the planning process must continuously pursue and faithfully serve the public interest. And planning process participants continuously strive to achieve high standards of integrity and efficiency so that public respect for the planning process will be maintained. And that applies to all of us anyway. APA members can go ahead and pursue continue to pursue their planning competence, as well as trying to inspire peers and try to look at all the people that are coming into planning. And it's a profession that we're all proud to be a part of. But basically, this Code of Ethics, of Ethical Planning Principles, was codified and adopted in 1992, and they're actually the basis for the AICP Code of Ethics. Now, the AICP Code of Ethics, how many AICP planners do I have? Have you read the Code of Ethics lately? One man over here has actually read the code. Oh, two, good. Well, my reminder here is I'm going to tantalize you with it, and I would like for you to go back and read it. Because it starts out that we as professional planners or members of the American Institute of Certified Planners subscribe to our Institute's Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, and the code is divided into 4 parts. The first part, A, is our aspirational principles. Part B, and I'm not keeping up, I don't do well two-handed here. I'm going to have to, okay, I'm going to read it over here. I don't want to read this whole thing to you. But we as professionals, well, can you hear me now? Can you hear me over here? Okay, I'm not tall enough. No. Do you remember seeing Queen Elizabeth when she went to the White House and all you could see was the top of her hat? That's what I really feel like behind these podiums. Or I'll spend the whole time standing on my tiptoes. That doesn't work real good. Bless your heart. We'll see. I don't think that's scary. Well, Section A contains... It works for me, I just don't know. Section A, of course, is the aspirational principles, and it's really what we, you keep using the word again, aspire to, what we really want to happen in our profession and how we practice our profession. Part B is the rules of conduct, and that's really the rules that we're held responsible for, that if somebody thinks we're violating them, they can report us. And C is the provisional, the rules that contain, I'm going to stop looking at the iPad, sorry. Section C describes the provisions of the code in the way you can get a formal or informal opinion. We have now at APA an interim ethics officer. He was just appointed by the board. He lives in the Chicago area, and I'm very sorry I've forgotten his name, but he's very good. But we have now we have a provisional ethics officer, and we're going to probably have a permanent one. Our new executive director of APA is an attorney, but he is not a practicing planner. We didn't hire a dentist, really, honest, we didn't. But we looked at hiring a professional association executive. So anyway, Section D then applies to the provisions of the code governing. Okay, in the AICP Code of Ethics, the principles which we subscribe to in Sections A, B, and C are derived from a special responsibility of our profession to serve the public interest with the compassion of welfare for all people, professionals, and our obligation to do so with such high integrity. You all, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but as certified planners, as members of APA, we share the goal of building better, more inclusive communities, which is certainly compatible with what CNU does. We want the public to be aware of the principles by which we practice our profession. We sincerely hope the public will respect our actions and our commitments to our employers and our clients, our fellow professionals. The principles to which we aspire. There are a bunch of them. We primarily serve the public interest as the first one. They're all equal. And therefore we owe it to really give the public, and everybody's the public, whether it's a planning commission or a group, anybody that shows any interest or even lives in any community, they're our public. They're our audience, as well as our detractors, as well as our supporters. So to comply with the obligations to the public, we shall always be conscious of the rights of others. I think we're seeing that with the demonstration out in front right now, the feeling like there's not rights of others. And we need to have a special concern for the long-term consequences. We don't operate in a vacuum. We want to be sure that what we're doing now is that word that we use so much is sustainable and works for the future. We need to look at the interrelatedness of the decisions. Some of us work in very narrow fields. As a planning commissioner, sometimes we forget about the interrelatedness unless somebody reminds us of it. And really giving clear and accurate information. Our overall, we continue to want to have a meaningful impact on development, as CNU does as well, and the participation of the public and any interest group should be broad enough to really include everybody that's involved in the process. Social justice is a very important part of our work as planners. We want to be sure that we include and expand that choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to really serve the underserved, those that are disadvantaged. We want to promote racial and economic integration, and we want to look at these policies as meeting those needs. We want to promote excellence in design and endeavor, and I think CNU has certainly challenged APA to rise to the occasion on doing better on these excellence in design. We want to conserve and preserve. Those terms are coming up a lot now, whether it's conserve or preserve something. But we want to look at the integrity and heritage and even the trees in Dallas. So we're working on our, we've changed from preservation to conservation now of trees. They don't vote, but they're still part of our Dallas DNA. We want to be sure we deal fairly with all participants. Sometimes when you're in a meeting, you want somebody to just sit down and shut up, but you need to listen. But to have those listens, you need some rules sometimes to give them instructions on how to participate. We want to look at the meaningful participation, and it should, as I said, it should be broad enough. And I got to get to the next one. There it went. We owe diligent, creative, and competent performance of the work we do in pursuit of our clients and employers. We've got to think, you got a balancing act at a lot of times to how you serve the public interest and what your employer wants you to do and what your client wants you to do. Sometimes you have to step back and say, this doesn't work. So that's why we need to do that independent professional judgment that we owe our clients and our employers. We have to accept the decisions of our client or employers concerning the objectives and nature of professional services, unless it's plain wrong or evil or illegal. or inconsistent with our primary obligation. And you want to really avoid conflicts of interest, or really even, it's not just avoiding the conflict of interest, it's avoiding that perception of the conflict of interest. And most conflicts of interest, I think, in this day and time are financial, or if you live close to it, or if somehow you own stock in something that you're working with. But you need to recognize it. And a lot of people don't recognize conflicts of interest. And it's important, sometimes when you're sitting next to somebody and you realize they have a conflict of interest, it's not out of line to tell them, just to ask them, do you have a conflict of interest? Don't you own property over there? Or maybe you should think about that. We had a case, because a lot of my life now is involved with Planning Commission, a case where a man's name on the commission came up in the staff report as being on the board of one of the businesses that was looking for a zoning change. And it was like, yoo-hoo. And it was interesting because the attorney said, I said, he's got a conflict of interest. She said, he has to tell me. I said, we need to protect each other. I think it's unfair. He did announce, somehow it got word to him, and he announced he had resigned from the board that morning. That's a little questionable as to whether he should have actually participated. All of these are really important to contribute to our development and respect for our profession. We need to keep learning, and that's what's so great about these conferences. They do give us such a chance to keep learning. And I continue to do my CM credits. I'm not that active as a planner anymore. I'm more volunteer these days. But I think we need to all look at keeping our sharp on what's going on in our profession. And that's where APA and CNU can work together, I think particularly. I just got back from our national conference in Seattle, and just the new things that are coming and keeping up to date with things are just really important. I'm going to keep moving through this. I remind you to read the Code of Ordinances. I mean, not Code of Ordinances, the code. You want to keep that planning research. We want to look at how planning theories apply to what we're doing. We want to contribute time and resources to the development of students, interns, and beginning professionals. APA has a new emerging young professionals whole structure of fees and dues and activities and interest. We want to look at representing misrepresented or underrepresented groups and continue our professional education. But our rules of conduct, and there are actually 26 of them, and I'm not going to read you all 26, but we will not recklessly, indifferent, fail to provide adequate, timely, clear, and accurate information, and not accept an assignment that we really can't do. We not advocate for a position that we've previously advocated on the other side. As salary employees, undertake other work unless we have the permission of our employer. As public officials or employees, accept compensation outside, no bribes. So we not perform any other work that we can't do. You also don't want to use your role as personal, that you may have a role and have some personal advantage. You're not supposed to use that in your work. Sometimes that's not to say you can't network, but it's not to do that. But as you go through these, you can read them and read them carefully, because I think it's much more important for you to hear what's going on as far as their case studies. But again, private discussions, confidential information, being very careful as to how we do that. Not to misrepresent our qualifications. That's not to say that we can't accept work if in what we do in RFPs and proposals, that we have to be sure that we have people that will do. We may not be us directly that does the work, but to be sure we represent everybody fairly and honestly and transparently. Okay, got it. No false information. Don't harass your clients, please. And selling services by saying we can get places with improper means. And this is a lot of things, and he's told me 5 minutes, so I want to get to the other. these are really good guidelines for you, whether you're CNU or APA. I'd say look at them because they do give you just some touchstones to get to know if you have something, and usually you'll have some sort of inkling if you're not doing something correctly. And if somebody brings charges on you, that you will cooperate. You don't want to retaliate. Most of these are pretty practical. And spelling them out is just giving us the detail. But you also, as AICP, you're supposed to notify the ethics officer. I did have one case one time where I was with a rather large firm, and some of our employees broke off and had another firm, and I just happened to be looking at their web page, and I saw projects that I had worked on this other firm's web page, and they hadn't, they were claiming them as their projects, their awards. So I called up a friend of mine that worked for the firm, and I said, I want my 17 asterisks. I want an asterisk after each one of my projects and awards, and I want you to say down at the bottom with that asterisk that these were done when the principals of this firm worked for other firms. So don't take credit for work. It took me 2 months to get my asterisks, but I got them. So I'm ready to look again and call him up and tell him I want my 17 asterisks. They should be over that. They have enough other work now. The C is the procedure for filing an ethics complaint. You can first ask for informal advice from the ethics officer. Then you proceed up the food chain to look at what you really would do as far as an ethics code. And then they convene a hearing and go through a lot of detail. Hopefully none of you ever get involved in any of this, and read the code so you don't get involved. We do have that planners that are convicted of serious crimes, they lose their certificate, or have a suspension of their certification. We actually did have a case last year where we got a nice letter from a man who was in jail for having pornography on his computer. So don't put pornography on your computer. Somebody might turn you in. But he turned himself in, so he was convicted of a crime. Now, to be eligible, there's a lot of eligibility for you all who may be considering membership in APA and AICP, and they're defined. And it's really graduate programs and how many years you need to work before you can take the AICP test. The certification maintenance, we do now, as of a number of years ago, have this certification maintenance, which we have 32 hours of continuing education over a period of 2 years. It's not that hard to get, although I thought it would be at first. It's turned out it wasn't. And if you don't meet your CM credits, you get a grace period, and then you get a grace period on top of the grace period, and then you can come back. But if you lose it totally, you've got to really take the test over, so you don't want to do that. So now, as final, AICP, and I think encouraged partly by CNU, have an advanced certification test that can be taken in urban design, along with the environmental planner and a certified transportation planner. So I think CNU and APA have an opportunity to continue to work together, to inspire each other, and to watch out for each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Oh. I'm going to be operating at the same elevation as you, so it's good that it's here. little short here. Okay. My ethical dilemma was, how do you operate in your community as a planner, and what happens in your community, and how do you deal with it? What's your role and responsibility? So the project that I'm going to bring forward is a highway project. Do we have the clicker? Thank you. And how do you deal with DOT? There's a highway through Asheville called I-26 that's been going on in our community. We've been trying to do this project since 1985. I'm not going to read all of this stuff, but when I moved to Asheville in 2003, the community was still trying to get their input heard by DOT. This is the highway impact area. And what you have is essentially, this is downtown Asheville right here. this is a local road that for one little stretch right here has a federal highway on it, which is kind of a little bit weird. So basically our federal highway does this kind of move. So the community is kind of cool with, all right, let's just do that, right? Let's just connect the dots and deal with it. Through that process, the community's been saying, well, can we get this local road back? Can we have our street back and mend our community? So all of the options essentially had this one river crossing right here, and how do you engage the DOT to deal with this? So thinking of this process, and we had a conversation about this in meeting this panel, I made a word cloud of the ethical responsibilities of an AICP professional just to see what's important to us as professionals. Immediately you see, well, obviously ethics is the driver, but how we practice as a professional is critically important. Additionally, inside the planning ethical code, planning, but also process. I want to dwell on the process point is very important as a designer. So it actually comes in number 4 on this, but it's how we engage the public. Now, as we all know in the CNU, doing the similar CNU word cloud, it's pretty clear, and we all know this, that design is the driver, and it's a very clear path toward creating neighborhoods and urban design. But these are correlated. How do we connect the two of them? So I'm going to go back to the process part, because I think the process part would drive and help us as designers make better community design. So this actually goes back to this guy. I don't know if you know this. Who's read the NEPA Act? Anyone? Got one? No, Dan's read it. The NEPA Act actually came from the Nixon administration in 1969, before the Nixon administration. And it's basically to allow us to have a legal engagement process to getting better community solutions. So we'll go ahead and just read this bottom part of it. To declare national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, to promote efforts that will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere, and stimulate health and welfare of man, and enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation. So this is essentially setting the guide for how this all operates, how you use federal dollars. We're actually protected with this act. Now, what's interesting when you dig into it, I don't know if you all can read that, but it says, this is the purpose of the law. It shall provide full and fair disclosure of significant environmental impacts to inform decision makers and the public of reasonable alternatives, and that's plural, all the choices that you have in design, which would avoid or minimize adverse impacts to enhance the quality of the human environment. So the law protects us to actually have a well-built, less impacted community environment. Additionally, it goes into detail to talk about facilitating a public process, avoiding or minimizing impact. And I love this one. Utilizing a systematic interdisciplinary approach which will ensure integrated use of the natural and social sciences and the environmental design arts in planning and decision making. So design is mentioned in this law to actually work on a highway. To use federal dollars in your community, designers should be involved. There should be an interdisciplinary team. When we asked DOT, we said, who's your interdisciplinary team? They said, well, we've got structural engineers, transportation engineers, civil engineers, and we have a historian. No architect, no landscape architect, no urban designer, no real estate professional. So just let you know that these are the things that the law gives us in the process to engage a process of community design, to integrate a systematic interdisciplinary approach to use design and decision making and make a better quality of human environment. This also stems back from Ian McHarg. For those of you that have read Design with Nature, it was basically a blast at DOT and how they were doing highways and communities. And I love this. The objective of an improved method should be to incorporate resource values, social values, and aesthetic values in addition to the normal criteria of physiographic, traffic, and engineering considerations. So when we look at the NEPA Act, it actually stems from a design book from the 1960s. So we understood this in Asheville, the impacts of the NEPA, because we had this thing up here, the boat catcher cut. DOT came in and just gave us that one option. They ripped the mountain open. And the community figured out in the process that we actually could have had other alternatives. So we have that lesson going forward. Getting into it, this is what a NEPA document looks like. It's about 2 inches of very, very, very boring stuff. But in it is the truth of what you can get in your community. So I'll show you how we use that in the process. And again, it's to provide reasonable alternatives. Just let that resonate with you. There's a plural there, there's an S. All of the alternatives had one bridge crossing. So we actually used that as part of the conversation to say, well, can we do something else? Can we just have a reasonable connection in some other location? That opened the door for a full conversation about this project. The American Institute of Architects was influential in this. We used an AIA grant to start a nonprofit to basically design the highway. And we offered a redesign as our public comment. So this is all, this is what the local community had said. So our citizens basically said, we want the local road back. That was our #1 priority. So that was our public comment in the year 2000. We used the AIA principles on top of that we all know, designing on human scale, et cetera. Sorry, let me just cut to the chase here. We opened an office. We opened a storefront. We cut a ribbon. We bought all of the DOT designs and hung them in this space so people could see the designs every single day. Any day they wanted to, we would open the doors. Typically what happens is those drawings go back up to the state capitol and we don't see them for a couple years. We bought those copies. So we also had a significant amount of meetings to do a design and engage the public. So we would meet every Wednesday night and hold a little charrette and actually do the work on this stuff to basically redesign it. So our proposal was looking at the DOT designs. Sorry, these are really crude cartoons of what DOT had given us. The community essentially rejected the first two because we didn't get that bridge back. We didn't get that local road back. So those are essentially off the table. While we were working with DOT, they eliminated one of their other designs. So let me ask you a really complex question. How many alternatives do we have as an offer to our community? Is that choice, So that actually gave us some leverage to get our own design. We creatively called ours Alternative 4B, is Plan B. And we showed the community. We said, look, this is the current interchange that we're all living with. This is what DOT is proposing. Does it make sense to propose something that's 9 times the size of the existing interchange? So we did some really creative things like taped all of their drawings together so that you could see it all as one comprehensive drawing. We took their highway, their asphalt, and essentially redesigned it and condensed it down to one thing. Now, it took us 4 years to get this added to the EIS document as an alternative, but we successfully did that. So we also made a model. This was our public comment. We actually showed up at a DOT meeting with this. This was an 8-foot by 8-foot model that we brought to the meeting. We're like, oh, you have to look at this. This is what our comment is. The community understood it. They couldn't understand the drawings, but they understood the model. The driving thing was getting back to Patton Avenue, get this land back, get this roadway connecting West Asheville to East Asheville so we can bicycle across this, et cetera. So we essentially designed the Champs-Élysées that never really happened. So we want this to make this happen in our community, a series of plazas and squares with buildings, basically. We bought some drawings, some images from Dan Price, Steve Price, sorry, of Urban Advantage. And this could be our community. We just show people, like, this is what we're talking about, just growing the street up and infilling in our community. Using images to convey to the public what we're talking about from a design standpoint, but the real key was getting this land back in the right-of-way. I don't know if y'all can tell where the public housing might be in this community, this picture. Boom. This is how we deal with it. It's run a highway around it, so that's not cool. We're trying to mend that, bring that part back into our community. So this is all currently right-of-way. So when we talk about getting that land back and doing the roadway, this is what we're talking about. So if you're starting here and coming into the community, this is what we're talking about. These are the pretty pictures that convey the image of design, right? So let's kind of take a step back. What the federal law says is we will pay for 90% of this highway, or at 85% now. So they hand that money to the state and says, give the community some fruit. Whatever fruit they want, you have to tell them how the fruit is good or bad for them, but they get to choose the fruit. So that money goes to Raleigh, in my case. Raleigh shows up and they're like, hey, you all want some oranges? And we're like, yeah, we like oranges, but really in this situation, it's kind of an urban location. Maybe give us an apple. Could we have an apple in the design process? So we essentially gave the apple to them because they refused to draw it. So that's what we're in. And in the process, we actually started engaging the community and explaining it to them. This is a spillover crowd that couldn't make it in the room the night that we did a presentation at the county, and I'll come back to this later on. And they were wearing these cool little things, the name of our alternative on their helmets. We spent about 2,000 hours of volunteer time just in the first year of this project, designing this project. We went out to all of these groups in the community to explain our design. We went to the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Club, about 200 meetings in 1 year. We're trying to show our community what it's like to work with DOT. It's not exactly a pleasant process in some cases. While we were working with DOT, with our alternative in the process, DOT started changing it. So we started getting a wider and then a wider highway. Then they took the highway and shot it over the top of the local road. And we're like, why are you doing that? And they're like, well, we just thought we'd try it. We're like, no, that's not our design. So we essentially pulled the plug. We're like, and I had to go back out to the community, and I was like, look, they're taking our apple, and they're saying, could you make it look more like an orange? And the community's like, that doesn't make sense. And I'm like, no, it doesn't make any sense at all. Now, the DOT responded, or people inside the DOT, by calling a public meeting to pull a vote. Now, this is in the process. This was not the time to do a vote. So I was now charged as a planner, how do I communicate this during a public meeting? The first thing that I did is I went out to the neighborhood and explained to them the impact in their neighborhood and left it to them if they wanted to come and challenge the neighborhood impacts. My role was to just put stuff into the record. I was just going to walk into the meeting and stand at the dais. I actually tried to not have the meeting. I tried to ask all of the politicians to please not have the meeting because we read the EIS. In a way, it was like the design that we actually shot down in 2000, DOT was pushing to come back, the one where they weren't going to give us the local road back. So it was like this zombie that just keeps on showing up. It's still walking around Asheville right now. So we read we read the EIS document and found massive amounts of inconsistencies in the document and put those into the record. So pulling the numbers, the first thing that we saw is they didn't do a cumulative impact analysis of what it would be to have these buildings come back. So when you run the numbers on it, there's a lot of buildings there. So we measured them, we counted the residential units, et cetera, and that turned out to be about $600 million of development, which would yield about $111 million of city, county, and school taxes. So from my community, if we don't get this right-of-way back, we lose this revenue, which is a significant amount of cash to my community. So that drawing is worth $111 million to my community, just from a taxable standpoint. So that needs to be in the EIS document, and it wasn't. When we looked at their numbers, they had the cost, the physical cost of all the roadways, but these first two have an opportunity cost. If you don't give us that road back, we don't have that opportunity to grow. So in the NEPA the NEPA Act, it actually gets into this, that all things that are relevant and important. So I'll ask you, as a taxpayer, is $111 million relevant or important to you? Of course. So that should be in this document as an opportunity cost. So rather than their design being cheaper than ours, once you add the opportunity cost, theirs becomes more expensive. And this is one of the things that we try to explain to our citizens, is that there is a cost when we lose this stuff. So ours is cheaper. Interestingly, when we looked at the real estate, our design was 100 acres less than their design, but when you look at the right-of-way estimate, it only cost them $400,000 for the additional 100 acres. Now, land in Asheville goes for about $1 million an acre near downtown. Why are they underestimating that impact? Again, you find these things. You just have to be patient enough to read and find the errors in the documents. Now, putting these measures out there is critically important because this is how the legal system works. This is the process that you can use to your advantage. I'm just going to skip through all the environmental impacts and stuff like that because really the law is there to help us reduce the resource consumptions in our community. So we ran the numbers. The amount of VMT that their design would produce is 37 million more miles of VMT per year in the region than ours. The CO2 creation, I mean, we just did the math on this. Incidentally, none of this was in the EIS document. So we're like, oh, you forgot this. We also ran the numbers on all of the jobs that would be created. We used the Chamber of Commerce numbers to pull this. The amount of new taxes, payroll, et cetera, for all these buildings that would now be in the project area. So we try as much as possible to be agnostic about this and just put that information into the record at that meeting. And the other thing that we found were the alternatives. In addition to that one section, there's another section over here. Sorry, there's 4 alternatives in this section, 4 alternatives in this section, and look at this section. There's only one choice. That's widening the highway, this right here, from a 4-lane highway to an 8-lane highway. The community's been asking for a 6-lane. Is that not reasonable? Could we just have a step in between? And our DOT wasn't giving it that to us. So we put into the record, this is what the law says, reasonable alternatives, it's plural. You've given us one section here. The cumulative impact, all of this stuff needs to be measured. In addition to adding anything that happens in the foreseeable future. So if we take a highway and double it, will there be an induced demand into the region of future growth, and why aren't you putting that in your document? Again, you can just ask these questions. If they're not in the document, it's an erroneous document. The process is there to protect us. And sure enough, they didn't put any of that in there. So they even state in the NEPA Act, it talks about having that induced effect. If you widen it, if I, can I essentially solve my obesity by buying bigger clothes? No. It's going to be a problem with the regional transportation system. We know this stuff. We've known it for 40 years. So we just put that forward and use the law to protect us. When we looked at the community impact, this is going to, from here forward, it's going to get a little depressing. In the community impact, they made no mention of the neighborhood that was being hit. Incidentally, they talked about the soccer stadium, they talked about a mobile home park, and they talked about a shopping center, and the golf course. No mention of the community of low wealth that sat adjacent to the highway that was hit the first time in the 1960s. These are the houses that got hit, or are getting hit. And we just put them into the record. The neighborhood came out, there was about 170 people that wore neighborhood t-shirts that asked to not have their houses hit. There's no mention of those houses. When you go into the document, you can find tables that talk about substantial impact to the Burton Street neighborhood, but no mention of it inside the document to community cohesion. And again, we just put that into the record. They should think about that. Churches, this was kind of interesting. No churches will be displaced by any alternatives, but yet when you look at the drawings, there's a sound wall going right through that church. There's an inconsistency in the documents. Incidentally, there's a table that actually talks about that church getting whacked, but no mention of it in the document. So this is, again, we put that into the record and let the process do its thing. Running through the impacts, our alternative is in blue, their alternative is in red. We just made a chart, showed people what their impact is versus ours. These are the environmental impacts. Incidentally, above the black line was actually in the document, below the black line wasn't. So we actually published a letter and handed it to DOT, and we're like, this is part of our public comment, you missed a couple things. Oh, by the way, you also missed all of these values that we grow in our community, in new taxes, new retail taxes, new jobs, new payroll. This should be part of your cumulative statement. It's kind of frustrating as a taxpayer to actually have to do DOT's job for them, but again, it was part of the process. The process is there to actually allow us that opportunity. Sorry, let me go back for a second. So that night, sorry, I think I know how to use this. That night we had the hearing. I went in, entered everything into the record. The community came out. There was 185 people that spoke in favor of our project. One person spoke in favor of DOT's alternative. It was the director of the Chamber of Commerce. And we lost. We actually lost the vote that night. The county voted against us. One of the county commissioners basically said, we're doing this decision for the entire county, not for your neighborhood. And I was like, you do realize they're all county voters, right? The next day in the newspaper, this is the only time I've actually had a cartoon about me. This is what was in the newspaper. And it was incredibly frustrating to watch this in my own community and to see this go down. And I thought I lost all hope. I thought this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. I felt like Jane Jacobs in 1950 or something. But what would come out of this, because of the process, is we loaded the record with public comment, with real data and real information. The DOT had to throw out the EIS. So we're still waiting. The next one's coming this year sometime. I'm looking forward to spending a little bit more time reading. But it stopped the process. Whether that's good or bad, we'd actually like to see the project done. But if it's going to harm my community in the process, let's try to avoid that harm. So again, it's just using these documents. Incidentally, in the far right-wing organization, ironically, was one that criticized me the most, and they actually blamed me in the presentation for single-handedly stopping the project, which I thought was kind of funny. There was about 150 people that were part of this. I was probably the most visible because of that meeting. In a way, I was kind of insulted when they did this. It's a little bit of borders on libel, but I'm no attorney because they printed it in their newsletter. But I'm also proud as a planner and as a community activist that we were able to stop that damage to that neighborhood, that we were able to get the record corrected, and we anxiously await the next design. So, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to not be Ann. I'm going to talk about a scenario that's a little different. I'm going to set this up as a rewilding scenario. There used to be interesting colors behind this, but they're gone, but that's interesting. And when I first started setting this up, I found two things today. Today was an interesting day because first I found that some of you may have gone to a session this morning about rewilding. There was a session this morning on agriculture and rewilding, which, did anybody go to that session? Okay, I think that's really cool, and it's something that I'm very interested in. So I'm setting up a scenario in which we're going to talk about some of the ethics involved in a rewilding circumstance. The second thing I found today is that if you are Googling for pictures of cougars in suburbia, you get something different than what I was looking for. Just so you know, in case you're ever looking for some support for this discussion. Completely different than what I thought I'd get. So here we have a cougar in suburbia that I was looking for. So let's see, what do we do? Aha, okay. So I'm going to talk about this scenario. Imagine you've got 200 acres of suburban retrofit, and this is based on some real things that are going forward right now. And let's say 100 acres of that's going to be developed as a high-density town center, and then 100 acres is going to be rewilded. And what does that mean? That means that within that 100 acres, we're going to restore the creeks and wetlands ecology. We're going to restore the trees. These days it's a little dicey. Are we going to restore them to a pre-development state? Which state? Is that a pre-human state, a state when Native Americans were there? Or is this an anticipatory state anticipating the impacts of climate change and whether any of those prior states will be appropriate forward? But we're going to do it. We're going to pay attention to the edge because the edge generates a lot of wildlife in all sorts of conditions. You can be in the middle of the rainforest and it's actually in the meadows that a lot of wildlife occurs. We're going to pay attention to that. And then we're going to reintroduce apex predators. And the reason we're going to do that is because ecological systems work best with those predators in. And one example is if you look at how Yellowstone was restored when the wolves came back in, the coyote population went down. That meant the fox population that competed with them went up. The elk population went down, but the aspen population went up. And because the aspen population went up, that allowed better treatment for water going into the streams, and the trout population went up. So all of these consequences occurred because of the reintroduction of the wolves. Well, the same thing applies across our society as we stop trying to hunt the sharks to extinction, stop trying to destroy the eagles, stop trying to destroy the wolves and coyotes and all of this stuff. So in this particular community, we're going to restore apex predators. We're going to construct trails and community gardens and a lot of things that are going to be benefits to the surrounding communities. Oh, and by the way, we're going to deal with the endangered species. We've got several species that are in our target area. Now, it looks like we're going to win. We've been going through the zoning process, and it looks like we're going to win, but a lot of the neighbors are tense. And they're tense. And the reason they're tense, we hear quite a bit. They want their dogs and cats to run free because that's natural. That's very interesting. They want to poison the coyotes so their dogs can run free. Oh, okay. Well, but that's natural. And we're sort of saying, well, maybe, when you look out west, there are still plenty of cats, even where there are coyotes. They're just smarter cats. And but there are things that we'll come back to address this. It's not that all of these concerns are unfounded. In fact, some of them are quite true. They're worried about joggers. They're worried about kids. I love this picture. Look at this coyote with the little girl in the background here. They're worried about landscaping, which is they're worried about that our animals are going to eat their flowers. The geese are going to poop on their lawns and all this sort of. They're worried about garbage cans, and they're worried about snakes and rats. Now, you're going to be trying to be talking about coyotes or cougars or something, and you'll always end up talking about snakes and rats. I don't care where you start in the system, you'll end up talking about snakes and rats. So those are their concerns. So I've got an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and when I went to law school, I took an environmental ethics course. I got an A+ in it. It's the only A+ I got in law school, but I got an A+ in it. So when I first came to do this today, I thought I'd be talking about ethics questions, all right? And some of the ethics questions that occurred to me, what's the human duty to other species? You know, is there a special duty to endangered species? Do they have a special status? Is the issue really a quality of human life issue? It's not about our duty to other species, but it's about the world that we want to live in. It may be about nature affinity or biophilia, that it's a more interesting world, any number of ways that we could say it might be about quality of human life. And how do we balance these duties against human safety, and how do we balance our personal rational understanding with irrational public fears? I thought that might be what it was about, but it's not. At least it's not when we try to extract our codes from codes of conduct. And we talked a little bit about this in advance. When we sort of turn and say, okay, well, am I going to get my ethics out of this? And that's not necessarily what these are first for, but I'm going to go through a series of different perspectives to try to extract how I, as a planner in this circumstance, ought to be thinking about how I interface with the community and how I represent my client in this instance, who's the developer, and just sort of what would drive my ethics. But first, let me ask you, in the last year, how many of you have had to stop in the middle of something and think about your ethics? You had to stop and think, what's driving me on this? What's my ethics? That's actually a really good set of the audience that's had to stop and think about what ethically am I supposed to do? And then we sort of ask, well, where do we draw the answer from? What do we look to get that? So I was interested. I went to the AICP Code of Conduct, and I went to Section B first. And that was because that's the part that's mandatory. As you heard Ann say, that's the part that somebody can come and prosecute you for if you violate this. And that makes it very serious. From a lawyer standpoint, that's in some ways the only part of it that's quite serious, because that's where we are held responsible by others. The other parts are where we are given aspirational ends, and those are where we hold ourselves responsible. So there's a difference between the two. And when I looked at that, I tried to find things that might guide me in deciding how I should interface with my neighbors and how I should go forward. I forgot to tell you, by the way, in this particular scenario, my planner has never handled a circumstance like this, has never handled rewilding. And so one of the challenges they also face is he or she is actually learning this as they go along. So they're studying hard, they want to do a great project. So some of the things that actually guide in the Code of Conduct, it's really about how you are as a professional, what you are doing as a professional and your responsibilities. And Ann sort of emphasized the part of this, which is out of the AICP, most of my duty is to the public. It creates an interesting circumstance if you're working for somebody in the private side of the equation, but most of my duty is to the public, and most of the Code of Conduct is either about that duty to the public or about my relationship with other professionals. So I have to provide accurate and adequate information on planning issues, all right? That's general. I'm not supposed to mislead in this. Don't do illegal stuff. That's my interpretation. That's not actually what it says. But don't do illegal stuff. Don't advocate in conflict with recent client positions. Don't misrepresent your qualifications or those of others or their views or findings. And don't accept work beyond your professional competence. Okay, well, have I already done that? I agreed to work on this rewilding thing, and I'm learning as I go along here. I'm not sure. Am I in appropriate circumstances to anticipate what are the real consequences to the neighborhoods around me? Can I really look up and say, well, no, it won't eat your child, or, no, it'll be years before there's a pack of coyotes here, and that's what you might really want to worry about. But, so Am I really prepared to do those things, or can I be? What would the standard I would be held to here before I would be in a position to appropriately address these things? And that's what this code deals with. And there are legitimate personal challenges about how you're doing your work. They don't actually tell you much about what your ethical standards should be vis-a-vis my question, but they tell you a lot about how you should be doing your work. So then I turn to the aspirational part. Right? So this is the part that I'm going to hold myself to. And be conscious of the rights of others. Well, that helps me in thinking about, okay, even working for this private party, I need to think about what rights the people around might have. Have special concern for long-range consequences of present actions. Well, that's kind of what the whole rewilding is about. It's about the long-range consequences of things. And so, all right, I'm going to have special concern for that. It really doesn't tell me how to have special concern for that, but I'll be real concerned about that. Pay attention to interrelatedness of decisions. Now, this is actually something that's kind of interesting to me because this is an embrace, in my world, of complexity. Because these issues are complex. I just told you about how Yellowstone works and the cascade of effects of the introduction of an apex predator, and there are other things that we talk about. In the absence of the apex predator, we'll need hunters to come in and take out the deer on this because they'll go to a certain population. We'll have a lot of raccoons and possums that will be subject to rabies, without an apex predator. There are these other things that go on in the system that if I understand them, I can actually begin thinking about balancing those because they're human safety concerns, the deer striking cars, any number of things. These are human safety concerns, and it starts sort of sounding like our discussion with the fire department as we say, no, you have to balance the safety of the 12-year-old crossing the street with the safety of the 12-year-old in the burning building. So this is more about me thinking about the relatedness of decisions. And give everyone clear and accurate information. Maybe this is one of the challenges when I'm working for the private side, is if I say, well, yeah, you might want to be worried about packs of coyotes, just as you should be worried about packs of domestic dogs, which is what exists in suburbia right now. When they become packs, they become a little more territorial about things, and you have to be aware. It might require a different response. Well, do I say that in a public meeting? Do I say that? Because that might just help out the citizens and their concern. Well, yeah, how are you going to stop from having large packs, or how are you going to keep us safe then? Is that now, if this is an aspiration, am I going to meet that from my side, or am I going to get fired that day? What goes on there? It's an interesting challenge. And then promote excellence of design and endeavor to conserve, here we go, endeavor to conserve and preserve the integrity and heritage of the natural and built environment. I thought I was there, except I'm not conserving and preserving anything because none of this exists right now. All right, this is the redevelopment of suburbia. The stuff that I want to do was wiped out long ago here. I want to regenerate it. So it doesn't actually apply, but it gets close. It shows me that the spirit of is there something a little more to it than just the human habitat, or at least contemplating that there are other aspects of that human habitat around us that are other than the building. So it got close. But I wondered what happened if I went to the AIA. There, the standard of care was sort of established by the norm of other architects. And by the way, the AIA, as I'm sure the APA does, has a wealth of other documents that you can turn to and say, wait, I've got some environmental standards over here, I've got some great guidance over here. All of these organizations have these things. I was really just trying to concentrate on their sort of core documents. So, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of great discussion in each of these organizations on this. Here, though, the standard of care established by the norm of other architects, and a relatively new discussion driven by the green building discussion, is that the architect shall discuss with the owner alternative approaches to design and construction of the project, including the feasibility of incorporating environmentally responsible design approaches. How many people here are members of the AIA? Okay. Did you ever think about maybe that might apply to the land design around a building? I did when I looked at this. Mr. Farr does, of course he does. But exactly this, in the AIA, your standard would be that you're supposed to bring forward the alternatives and discuss these somebody, and then when you go on into it, if you're not qualified to actually talk about those things, then you're supposed to bring in somebody who does. So again, much of the standard is focused on how you relate to other professionals, but this one got close. It really doesn't give me the kind of guidance I would have wanted here. So So I turned to the ASLA and their Code of Environmental Ethics. Aren't these pictures cool? I thought these were some of the coolest pictures once I got over the cougar thing. But by the way, if you look for foxes in suburbia, again, you've got some problems. So in the ASLA, it is, as you might anticipate, rich in discussion that was on point for my particular circumstance. And a general instruction to make every effort within our sphere of influence to enhance, respect, and restore the life-sustaining integrity of the landscape for all living things. And then the principles of land use, planning, and design, and the principles of wildlife habitat protection should be integrated to promote the enhancement, protection, and management of landscapes that promote wildlife. And I'll tell you, there's really 6 or 7 other of the aspirational principles. They're all stated as shoulds, so they're really not that different than the aspirations that we began with. But the aspirational principles were pretty much all on point. And for me, it was an interesting sort of, okay, now I'm getting the discussion that I sort of was looking for some guidance in this. All right, so that's on point. But then I wondered, all right, well, I'm in a world of new urbanists. So what do we have? What do we have? When we put aside our hats, we may be wearing ASLA hats. Anybody ASLA in here? Yes, one. All right, super. So when we put aside our other hats from these other organizations, is there anything that this one, the CNU, tells us that's instructive on this? So I went to the charter. Farmland and nature are as important to the metropolis as the garden is to the house. Beautiful, but not particularly helpful. But at least a direction. Now, a direction that tells me that within our tribe, this is a discussion that's important. But then don't blur the edges of the metropolis. Yeah, that fringe stuff and all this, I'm all about blurring. All right, but then, how many of you have ever looked at the canons of sustainable architecture and urbanism? 3 folks, 2 of whom are on the board, or were on the board. Excellent. I encourage you, when you are encountering, in fact, when you're not encountering, I encourage you to go and look at the canons of sustainable architecture and urbanism. They are our companion to the charter of the new urbanism, and they're on the cnu.org site. And when I looked there, it was really interesting. In a location with little or declining growth, habitat restoration shall be promoted on already urbanized or underutilized land. Very specific, not my circumstance. I took suburbia, I took half of my 200 acres, and I put a lot of density on it. I'm a growing area. I actually had a different vision of urban, in which biophilia, nature affinity, were aspects of the city I was building. And this provision is so specific that I would have been violating this because I was doing this in an area where population was growing. So I was a little disappointed, but I was happy to see that it was at least addressing, again, directly the notion that this was an appropriate undertaking. This was appropriate to our provision. But it actually got better as I went forward. Imperiled species and ecological communities shall be protected. Not should, shall be protected. Fascinating. And I wondered how many of our tribe, how many of the folks who gather for CNU think about that sort of instruction, aspirational instruction. Then projects to regenerate and recreate natural habitat shall be promoted. And I was fascinated to determine that out of this, out of my planning, architecture, landscape, and new urban worlds, I wasn't surprised to find the ASLA was the one that most directly addressed my challenge with my rewilding, but I was quite pleasantly surprised to find that within our ethical instructions and our aspirations within new urbanism, we had guidance on this, and I think it's the right guidance. And I found it helpful to at least take me to the point where I would say, okay, out of all of this, I know this is the right thing to work on. Out of drawing from my AICP discussion, I know that if I'm going to do this right, I need to be honest about the concerns of the surrounding neighborhoods. And some of those are addressed by saying, snakes are not really a problem here. But others are addressed by helping people understand mitigations that can be undertaken. When you do cougar reintroduction programs, by the way, you simultaneously advance a program so that if there are misbehaving cougars, you remove them from the community. But in many communities, cougars has moved forward, and it turns out that just as eagles are very adaptive and they behave in a way we didn't anticipate, they actually do very well in coming into human communities. Cougars are able to do the same thing. They're able to come into urban areas. There are many places you can document this, but it doesn't mean they're all the same. Just as all eagles aren't the same, all cougars aren't the same. Some of them come in and misbehave. It might be my responsibility as the developer going forward with this to create a program to deal with that. The same thing with each element, to take my public responsibility as an important component and think of the ways that I could legitimately address their concerns so that the end result really was better for everyone, really was a step forward for both the feature I was trying to preserve or create, the preservation of endangered species and the reintroduction of apex predators, and the creation of something that from a human standpoint I think creates a much greater future, a much more enjoyable quality of life, as well as doing a number of other beneficial things for the future. So that was my balance that I came out of it. And I wanted to leave some time for questions for all of us, so I'm going to stop there. I found this area of rewilding, though, full of interesting challenges, and I think this even more so as I see at the CNU, which I probably would not have bet on a rewilding discussion occurring. I think that it will occur, and I think that we'll have more of them, and I encourage you to think about them from not only a practical how do we do them, but from an ethical standpoint. Thank you very much.
We have plenty of time. We can start with some questions, sir.
I have a question for Joe, but also for all of you. So in the issue of dealing with DOT and the community concerns, it seems that you were a strong advocate, a full-throated advocate. And I'm not sure how much it's an ethical question, but I think it is. And I know that advocacy planning is one area that's studied when it comes to planning. And I'm just wondering, in situations like this, and I'm assuming you're employed by a municipality, or local government, what is the proper role, tone, posture for a planner in a situation like that, where you may agree, be angry at the city, be sympathetic with what the community represent them. But I'm wondering, and maybe you have some perspective now, if you were a little too assertive, or if you might, in retrospect, might have adjusted your tone.
That's a great question. I don't know if it's possible for me to adjust my tone, for those of you that know me, but I actually am not employed by the city. I was in the private sector at the time, working actually in real estate development in the downtown. The frustrating thing for me was kind of I must have bit my tongue off, just not saying stuff, because what was notable to me at that meeting, that presentation, the city planning department wasn't there, the county planning department wasn't there, and the MPO planners were not there. That here we are having a critical public discussion, and it was notable that none of the professional public sector planners were involved in the decision or even made comment in the process. So ethically, or actually as a citizen planner, as a citizen taxpayer paying those individuals, I wanted them there as my professional to have a public comment on this. But I had to ethically understand that they were essentially being muzzled. Not that I agree with it, I would have liked to have seen them do something, but I didn't criticize them for their choice in the process. So not once did I say they should be here doing this.
But Joe, could we explore two aspects of that? One is whether when an AICP member steps up and is speaking as a private individual participating in the process, they happen to be subject to this code of ethics. Are they supposed to behave within that code of ethics when they're acting on their own behalf? Is there their duty instruction to, whether it's against their own interests, or is that the part that says you have to announce your interest? How do you behave vis-a-vis that code of ethics when you're simply acting on your own behalf?
I mean, I guess that's up to the individual. I took it as having to keep myself inside that boundary of not being a critic and not going over the line in the advocacy position. I mean, we were also part of the designers of this, so I guess I maybe did cross that line. But I don't know, it's an interesting dilemma. Ann?
Well, I think you would be remiss if you had not stepped up, and because there's all sorts of things in our aspirations and our rules that want us to advocate for those that are underserved, and certainly the people that had those houses were not. I think we're not trying, as with a code of ethics, to muzzle people, and we do have our individual interest and our individual expertise. I think in this case, if somebody filed a complaint against you, I'd certainly defend you on this, because I think it really, if we don't bring those things out, we're remiss in that we're not providing clear and accurate information, and that's one of the things we need to do.
Yeah.
So what if we flip it around and the planners for the city, for the county here, are AICP members? They don't show up because they're instructed by their client that they should not participate, but it was clearly in the public interest that they participate in the process, that they give information. There, does the client instruction trump the requirements for public? Should they have shown up anyway? Should they have appeared in the crowd and said, "I'll probably lose my job for being here tonight, but I'll tell you what the real deal is"? What's the ethical responsibility there? By the way, again, philosophy major. Sorry.
Well, I have a case that I did step up as a planner. We had, and it was highway again. They proposed widening a highway and putting overpasses in the area that were going to go over two main roads, and it really wasn't a good idea because it was going to take out all the new development, and the city had just annexed the area. Therefore, the city was going to be, that I worked for at the time, was going to be responsible for paying for those and paying for the utility cost. And I probably stepped out. I talked to the developer and said, people need to write letters. And so, then I talked to the mayor, a little planner, little town. And, I said, really, we got $10 million worth of new development here, and it's going to cost $1 bajillion to relocate these businesses. So I talked to the mayor. A little while later, the mayor and I were called into the city manager's office together, and we're standing there kind of shuffling our feet, and the mayor was about the same height I am. And the city manager's going, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have talked to the mayor. And about 2 weeks later, at the city council meeting, all of my words came out of the city manager's mouth. I didn't get fired, and then later when I left that city, he told me I taught him everything he knew about planning, which was downright scary. But you have to sometimes step up, and I stepped up. Granted, I had a personal interest. I lived 2 blocks off of where those overpasses were going to be, and my neighbors were concerned, so I felt like I both represented the city in that case, and I represented my neighbors.
Did you disclose your personal interest?
Yep, he knew where I lived.
Sir?
I know where you live. No.
One of the advantages is schizophrenic, because you really have to talk about, well, and I always find solace by saying, hey, if you represent, if I were you, knowing where you stand, I would look at these things. I personally don't agree, or as a city, this is the kind of position. And as long as you're forthright with all of that, and you lay those things out, I usually don't find any trouble with that, one. And two, usually the better solution comes forward when
I have two parts to an answer to that. For the first is, we encounter that situation all the time in the creation of mitigation banks, and when we begin to create circumstances that are supposed to balance for other circumstances, and people don't admit that the original thing that we're balancing for is a system in flux, and it can disappear, is subject to drought, subject to changes in conditions, and so you have to first be honest about the functionalities that you're balancing in that. The second part of it is, when we talk about something like rewilding, the reason it's become an important issue for me is because in the natural course of the dominance of humans in the world, these other species will disappear. So if you were just talking about natural course, you wouldn't rewild, because these species will disappear. We will get, the varmints rule the earth, or whatever the consequence is of the loss of the apex predators. That would be the natural thing. So when we set our targets in something like this, and we say we want this condition, part of the reason to accept this condition is a cougar that lives in suburbia is no longer a cougar as cougars once were. It is a compromise, and some environmentalists reject the compromise. But there are only so many wild places now that you'll conserve. And my point in this is that when we as humans make choices about the habitats we want to create and maintain, and this was Lyle's point when in his book when he wrote, we as humans are taking charge of the ecosystems. So we better be honest about we are responsible for exactly what those ecosystems are. There's a little hubris in that because we're not completely in control of those. I work with environmentalists who say you create that condition, you create wetlands, and then because we've rewilded it, you let it go to whatever it is. We create the creek, but if the beavers come in and turn that into a pond, and in 20 years that pond gets silted up and it turns into another wetland, that is the condition that we allow to go forward. Our challenge is when we create that pond or we create that creek and then we park houses around it and we say the value now for these houses is driven by a particular view, then everybody gets attached to that thing and they want to freeze that thing in time, instead of what we might adopt a view of biophilia or nature affinity, in which the thing to watch is the wonderful changes over time and the aliveness of a system. But it takes a lot as humans for us to actually figure out how not to just create half a system. So that wetland without beavers, cougars, all the things that balance out, maybe half a system, and so it's not necessarily going to follow a normal course.
Doug?
Yeah, two things. One is at CNU 2 or 3, maybe somebody can remind me, I signed and others signed a pledge, a written pledge that said, by joining the Congress for New Urbanism, I hereby agree not to engage in the creation of suburban sprawl. That pledge was signed in writing 21 years ago. For the philosophy major, is it still binding? So that's a rhetorical. That actually it's of interest to me. What happened in that?
That pledge actually continued. That pledge continued in new memberships. I don't know if it's still done, but that pledge continued in new memberships for quite some number of years. That wasn't a one-time event.
Yeah, I think we've been upholding that pledge.
It's one of the reasons why I hid my membership from my 1,000 partners, but okay.
That was one, just of general interest question. The second thing is, in your ethics, the one you did comment on is the one I feel is most powerful, which is my state license. As a state licensed architect, like engineers, I am legally bound to uphold the public health, safety, and welfare, as are all engineers. And that's where the fun starts. So I've started to use that as a kind of lightsaber with fire marshals, and it's pretty interesting conversation. So I'd love to hear your reactions.
Yeah, well, we've had a similar discussion saying that now that we have documentation from the Centers for Disease Control on the impacts on human health from walking, we all should be able to walk in and get a zoning ordinance passed that is pedestrian oriented, and we should be able to put that information on the table and say, there is no question about this being related to health, safety, and welfare, all right? So eyes on the street, all of the things that we think are important are related back to that. Same sort of thing in the discussion that I'm advancing, in which we have increasing studies, more on the way, that link nature affinity to all sorts of things, reductions in crime, higher mental health, balance to the stresses of the city. So as we again get documentation, we can put that on the table as professionals and say, I don't even have to get to these specialized statements. Just in doing my job for that general benefit of the public and that health, safety, and welfare, these attributes are important. I agree with the direction of that very much. I don't know that until we've made that connection in the public's eye and in the eye of government officials, though, that it gets us very far. We need more work on establishing the premise that that's what we're about. And years ago, we'll go back to an Andreas presentation. Years ago, Andreas did a 3-hour presentation to the APA in New Orleans, and I was there. And he opened by saying, I'm one of you, I'm a planner, and we were once a respected profession. And he went on from there, but his point was that this idea of representing the public, and his point on that day was this idea of representing the public meant that you had to stand up and say that not having sidewalks, not having walkable streets, allowing the car to be done would harm the public, and that was part of your ethical responsibility. And so for years we've had that premise within the CNU that is part of our ethical responsibility to stand up for it. I argue that premise goes further, and we have support for it to say now that we have this obligation to think about our footprint on the world and the world we as humans want to live in, and whether it's occupied by other species and whether we can breathe in it.
I'd like to add to that just a little bit. This session is critical importance to have these conversations and elevate the education of our roles and responsibility here at the APA conferences, and I think it was at an APA conference where one of the dilemmas posed was that hanging on the word sustainability, and why don't we go further and add in information about carbon and obesity and all these other things that we now know about. And again, these are all parts of how we should be behaving as a professional, and how do we elevate that, how Ann stood up and defended the information into the community with the mayor. These are all things that we have to be doing as practicing professionals, and this is essentially a reminder, a big, firm reminder as a session for us to do that in practice when we leave this room.
I think it's also the word, I would say, that's really uniting those concepts for many of us is resilience. Because when we look at resilient communities, it's not just about their electrical systems or whether they've hardened their landscapes or whatever they're doing vis-a-vis the environment. We find that it's also about the social equity, it's about the distance between the rich and the poor, it's about the nature of the neighborhoods, and it's that resilience discussion as it integrates into the professional standards that will cause people to have to think about how their community operates when there's a disruption of the gasoline supply, when there's these different challenges that we saw after Sandy. And truly resilient communities will not only address their resource use, but they'll also address the community itself, whether you can walk in it and whether all aspects of society are treated equally.
I think all of the ethics codes and charter, all of us, it's there to give us a backbone in what we do as planners or as designers or as lawyers. There's always that backbone. If you don't reside on or rely on those aspirations, those rules, then you can wimp out, and you really shouldn't wimp out on your community.
We have time for one more question. Victor?
Well, it's an observation about the new urbanists. The new urbanists are always the ones that, in the time when I've been practicing, were the ones who would stiffen up in a meeting and say no to something, would turn down work, or resign from a job or fire a client while they asked us to do something that didn't make any sense. And I have a
raise your hand if you've ever turned down a job that wasn't right. Who's going to be left? You know, no, I better put it in my hand. Even I.
That's the pledge. That's the pledge that you sign. Don't take the job or walk away from a client now and then, if necessary, to do this kind of work. Then we know you really mean it.
I think that that's sort of a double-edged sword, though, right? So I also had the opportunity to take work that was not right in its concept, so that I could get in there and educate them intensely over a long period of time to change the trajectory of a giant cruise ship, right? It takes a long time to ship them.
I think that's a great point.